Today's video will be short, but quite a fun one. It will be about how to play when a straight is already on the board. This spot comes up very rarely, so I'm going to keep the video short, but I think one 25-minute video throughout one's poker career is probably just about the smart level of time investment for the spot. And it's nice to know the rough shape of the strategy because it has some quite unique features. So the spot is straights already on the board, and the unique feature is that when your opponent has a bluff catcher, they're only playing for half the pot and they never get to win the extra money that you put in as a bet, and this will affect the bluff to value ratios quite a lot. When you find yourself on the river in such a straight on the board spot, the following are the considerations to think about. So obviously first, who has the nut advantage, and then also how often do they have the nuts? Is it something that they have really quite a lot of the time, or is it more infrequent? Then what is the stack to pot ratio, as this affects whether to go all in and how often to bluff and so on. And then also relevant is whether there are different categories of nutted hands, whether there's like a longer straight with 2 extra cards or maybe a backdoor flush, that's also possible. But I won't really go into the last bullet point here because, as I said, this will be a short video. But the scenarios that I will discuss are mainly the one scenario where one player has a decisive nut advantage, and the other scenarios where the nut densities are similar. And the main difference is that in the first scenario, all-in overbets are more of a central part of the strategy. Because as we know from other areas in poker, when one player has a decisive nut advantage, they can overbet all in. In typical poker spots, even when the overbet is really, really large, they at most get to include 50% of bluffs. Because when they lose the entire overbet they put in, so they cannot have more than 50% of bluffs. But since this is not the case when the opponent is only playing for half the original pot and they never win the overbet on the river that the player with the nut advantage puts in, then there's actually no ceiling to the optimal bluffing ratio, which means that in a hypothetical where someone were to bet nearly infinitely big in such a scenario and the other player only has bluff catchers, the player who overbets would have to have basically 100% of bluffs to sustain that sizing and ever get called by bluff catchers, which is obviously silly, but it goes to illustrate that it's very easy to be too value heavy in these like large overbet lines in that spot, and that obviously allows you to fold your entire range if you think your opponent isn't aware of that. So yeah, the implications of these bluff to value ratio considerations are that if the SPR is low, it's quite possible to have not enough value to make the other player indifferent with their bluff catchers, so they will actually always call. Because if the SPR is low, even if you maybe overbet for 1.5x the pot, if your nut density is not very high, you don't have a lot of nutted hands, it just can be the case that even if you go all in every time with a bluff and with value, the other player will just call all their bluff catchers, which is not great for your bluffs because they're just getting free rolled. For once in a blue moon, the other player does have the nuts too, even if you have the nut advantage. But it's fine for your value hands because they will always get called by worse. And then at the high SPR, the risk is obviously the opposite, that or the interesting consideration is the opposite, namely that you will have too much value for the all-in bet size, and if the SPR is very high on the river, you actually have to hold back from going all in too often with your value, and you have to play different bet sizes as well. And so how do you do that? So you still go all in some of the time, with obviously a lot of bluffing in the all-in size because it needs to be very, very bluff heavy. But then most of the time you have the nuts, you go for a smaller sizing, and it can still be an overbet, B150 for instance, if the SPR is say 8, so really large, and you still playing B150, you give your opponent room to rebluff, and when they rebluff, they profit more because now they actually can win the entire original pot and your overbet when you fold against the rebluff. So that's why the knotted hands are indifferent between all in and the smaller bet, because they sometimes also get paid a lot in the small bet line. So now I'll just show a concrete example of a board where any 7 makes the straight, and here it's under the gun 8 versus big blind, and the big blind will have the nut advantage because they have a lot more 7s in their pre-flop range. And the main thing that we will look at here is how the SPR influences the river strategy when we look at the same spot at 100 deep, 60 deep, and 30 deep. And I already prepared to solve. I'll actually start with the lowest stack size. So this is 30 deep. This is the under the gun 8 range. Big blind calls here with a range that obviously has a lot of 7x here. It's not a lead board, so the big blind checks, and then I just made under the gun pick some of the highest frequency sizings. So here's small bet, big blind calls. Turn is a 4. Here the big blind essentially leads range. I made under the gun call, and then on a board straight completing river, the big blind now doesn't have enough value hands to make the opponent's bluff catchers indifferent. So the strategy is just everything goes all in, and under the gun calls everything. Now the same board, I won't go through the action again, but the same board at 60 deep, it's quite different on the river. Well, I say that, but it's mostly the same, except that there's a little bit of a smaller sizing on the river. And that's just because now we just happen to have stumbled on a situation where the stack to pot ratio on the river is roughly right for just going all in with almost the entire range, and that is evenly matched or has the right match bluff to value ratio. So now when the big blind goes all in, under the gun is properly indifferent with their bluff catchers, and they fold the worst bluff catchers. Here the ace is pretty bad to have because the ace makes up most of the hands in the big blind's range. So even if the big blind tries to use different cards as a bluff, they just have so many times they have an ace that they have to bluff with an ace more often than with any other card. So that's why under the gun here folds hand with an ace and basically mixes calls with everything else. And that's how the spot works. And then if we go to the 100 deep situation, now if the big blind were to go all in with all their value hands, then under the gun 8 would just fold their entire range of bluff catchers. It would be too value heavy for this large sizing that needs to be very, very bluff heavy. So instead, the big blind also plays this smaller sizing and even has some checks. And if we look at what a straight does, and here GTO Wizard is smart enough that when it says a straight, it means a straight that's better than the board. So here we see the big blind has 12.5% of straights. And the way they play is that very infrequently they check. Sometimes they go all in, but roughly almost 4 times more often than the straight goes all in, it goes just in this B150 sizing. So the B150 is a lot more value heavy than the all in. And if you suspect that your opponent doesn't understand this, you can just overfold against the all in and then maybe over attack this other sizing, for instance. So if the big blind goes all in here, then the other player has to do a bunch of bluff catching in equilibrium, obviously. And if the big blind goes in the 150 sizing, there's also bluff catching, and there's even a bit of rebluffing, because now the rebluff, when it gets through, you win quite a big pot. And yeah, interesting to see how much the big blind has to defend against the rebluff with just playing the board, basically. Since it's just quite a small raise, it's only 22 more to call. Going back into the presentation, so now we saw the scenario where one player had the decisive nut advantage, and next is the scenario where players have the nuts similarly often, and here we can distinguish 2 different levels of nut density. One is where both have the nuts really a lot, and the other one is where it's not that frequent. When both players have the nuts a lot, then it's important to only play small sizings, because there's just little room for rebluffing, and there's no point in using bigger sizings because you just get called or raised by nutted hands. So here I constructed quite an extreme example with the preflop ranges, and here the board will run out such that a straight ace makes the straight, and obviously ace is always the most frequent hand in the preflop ranges here. So under the gun raises gets called by hijack, flop queen jack 10, under the gun bet small, hijack calls, turn is a 9. Under the gun here I made them check, hijack checks back, and as you can see, ace x does this really frequently. River is a king, and now both players have a straight or an ace, basically have the time in their range. So here, yeah, you can see 48% for under the gun. And the only sizing used is here block bet b20. Because even just against b20, the hijack will do only a little bit of bluff raising, and most of the raises are just by nutted hands. And when the hijack makes a small raise, they fold out some bluffs, so the rebluff gets through some of the time, and that wins some chips, or at least there's like 0 EV. But when they get re-raised, it's just always the nuts. And then when under the gun checks, the hijack also only plays small sizings. Here a b50 comes in, and then b20 as well. And against that, the under the gun player, when they raise, they always have the nuts, and they just bluff catch with other hands. So anything larger than b50 here would just not accomplish anything at all. Like if the hijack bets even just b75, as we can see here, there's no bluff catching at all. So the nutted hands would just never get paid, and it's a sizing that is way too big, and it's negative EV to play essentially, because it'll only it'll never get called by worse, basically. And now for the last scenario, that's probably the most common scenario, is the nut densities are somewhat symmetrical and they're not like unusually high. And that's also the scenario that's unfortunately hardest to play, but I still collected a few heuristics that should be useful. So mostly I saw the solver use intermediate sizings in the spot, for instance B70. Sometimes it's like B50, sometimes maybe B110 or B90 or something, but I personally will just simplify it to B70. Out of position is meant to check some because they will also face a river action from the other players, so they need to be protected. Rebluffing happens somewhat frequently against these like intermediate sizings, and I found it just very complicated and basically impossible to balance ranges as a human, so I haven't even really studied how often I would bluff with various bluffing candidates, and I think, yeah, we just have to wing it, but it's still useful to know a few heuristics and to know which sizing has to be very value heavy, which one has to be bluff heavy, and how often rebluffing happens in the solver and so on. And we will look just at one example for the spot, and the board will run out such that any queen makes a straight. And again, takeaway is mostly default sizing of somewhere in the B70 region, and then bluff catchers will be indifferent between fold call and rebluff. And sometimes the all-in can remain an option, particularly for the in-position player, but maybe not if the stack to pot ratio is quite large. Like at 100 deep, I didn't see it in this specific spot, but I saw it at 60 deep pre-flop. So yeah, we will briefly look at it. It's button versus big blind. Button raises, big blind calls, flop 10-8-7, big blind checks range, and then button, I made them bet B30, big blind calls, turn is a check, big blind checks. Here it makes sense for the button to use a small sizing, because if they bet too big, then the big blind will only continue with straights and two pair, and that would be condensing the range too much. So button bets B33, big blind calls, the river completes the board straight, and now the big blind plays a few leads for B75, and when they check, now the button also uses B75 the most frequently when they bet, and they can play an all-in range, and again the all-in range has to be more bluff heavy than the other sizing. So here we see queen queen and queen 10, but not really much in terms of other queen x, whereas in the B75 sizing we see a lot more queen x. And just to look at the rebluffing, when the button bets B75, there is a bit of rebluffing, and as we can see, bluff catchers are basically indifferent between all three options. When they rebluff, there is even a bit of rebluffing by the button player, and at that point they only get called by nuts and super nuts. So yeah, there isn't too much to say about these spots other than you have to just wing it, but still there are some pitfalls to avoid. Namely, it's really important to avoid nonsense sizings, and the nonsense sizing here would be to bet any of these players would be to bet somewhere in between all-in and B75. Like if someone bets B150, that would be a disaster for the reason I will explain. So basically, if you overbet half your stack for B150 in a spot like the one we just looked at, there are two objectives of that bet sizings that are at odds with each other. One objective is that if you put in a big bet and the opponent's bluff catchers only play for half the pot, in order to incentivize bluff catchers to call, your bet needs to be very bluff heavy. But the other incentive is that you want to be protected against raises, especially if you put in half your stack and your opponent, when they go all in, they will win a lot of chips if you fold, and you can't really fold very often because they're getting a good price for reshoving on you if they just put in twice your bet. And so you need to be able to defend against jams, which means your overbet needs to be fairly value heavy. But we saw now that it wants to be very bluff heavy, but also very value heavy, and they cannot be both at the same time. And the solver will pick the lesser evil if you force it to play this nonsense bet sizing. And then here the lesser evil is to be very value heavy, but this means that you will just never get paid off with bluff catchers, which is a catastrophe for your value hands, and you just lose a lot of EV that way. So when we look at this, here on the top slide, you see the situation as it naturally comes up in the solver, when the solver can use efficient bet sizing. And we see here that the EV of the button player whose turn it is to act here, when they choose smart bet sizings, here either B66 or all in, then their EV is 12. However, when you force them to use this stupid bet sizing, the EV drops to 10. And obviously that's one of the worst things I've ever seen from a bet size change in poker. And you really don't want to do this. And if the button does bet B150 for half their stack, the big blind won't even go all in with all their nutted hands. Because if they were to go all in, they only get called by hands that tie. So the only pure all in here is the super nuts, and sometimes you rebluff, but mostly just, yeah. So basically when the button goes B150 for half their stack with, it's just really bad for their value hands, and they need to put in a lot of value hands because otherwise they can just get rebluffed too often. So it's a disaster bet sizing. That was it. And so now just to summarize the video, when you find yourself on the river on a board straight, the three main factors to think about are who has the nut advantage, what is each player's nut density, and what's the SPR, and what does the SPR mean about bluff ratios when you go all in, for instance. And then the bluff to value ratios are more extreme than in typical spots. So when you bet small sizings, they need to be extra value heavy. When you bet large sizings, they need to be extra bluff heavy compared to a normal poker spot. And then lastly, as we saw just 2 slides earlier or so, non-all-in overbets for half your stack would be a disaster, and that's like the main thing to avoid. And if you see your opponent do this, you know they probably haven't studied the spot, and then you can play according to that. And the main exploit would be not to try to bluff them. And then and obviously you never call with bluff catchers. If you have a bluff catcher, the only thing to consider is fold or all in. And then also, last part of the summary is in the scenario where one player has a decisive nut advantage, then overbets will always be a part of the strategy. And the main thing you want to think about is if you were to overbet your entire range, will it be too value heavy? And if the answer is yes, because your overbet is for a very big sizing, then you need to also use smaller sizes than the all-in. And in the spot where the nut distribution is symmetric, if both players have the nuts a lot, for instance, because it's an ace that makes a straight and both ranges get to the river with ace-x often, then you want to use block bets only. For both players, that's the case. But if the nut density is not like unusually high, then I would suggest maybe something in the range of B70 by default for both players. Sometimes maybe in position after out of position has already bet some of their nutted hands. Maybe in position gets to play some all-ins too if the SPR isn't like really, really large, but still mostly B70 would be the default sizing. And when you use such an intermediate bet, rebluffing and sometimes even re-rebluffing happen in the solver, but obviously for humans that's going to be something you want to think about in exploitative terms, and you just want to think about, is your opponent ever bluffing enough here or bluffing too much, and then decide according to that. And so yeah, a lot of these 5 straight board spots need to be played by feel, and it's kind of complicated and there's not much to say, but still I feel like, yeah, there's still some good to know hard rules that we can remember. And these are like, avoid nonsense sizings, don't put in half your stack, and then for an overbet, and then also don't make your all-ins too value heavy, because they need to be very bluff heavy to ever get called by bluff catchers. And then if you see your opponent go all in and they may not know this, yeah, maybe you can overfold. And then lastly, also, if the nut densities are quite high, you probably just want to bet small. Yeah, now you know that's probably more than you. It's probably enough to never study this spot again in an entire poker career, because it's quite rare. But still, it's good to know, and now you do.